Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to start very, very, very slowly because there are only 17 people in the room, and I want to give as many people as possible the opportunity to join us before I begin. Hold on. Right, we now have 24 people, so I'm going to begin. Thank you very much for coming to hear me speak this afternoon. I, first of all, need to make an arrangement about timing. Somebody needs to tell me when to stop. The subject on which I would like to speak this afternoon is, in my opinion, the most interesting subject in the known cosmos. And the problem with that is that once I start talking, I don't stop. And unless somebody gives me a signal, after about 40 minutes, there is a very real possibility that I will still be here talking on Sunday afternoon. And so if perhaps my kind assistant here could throw something at me in about 40 minutes' time, I should be very grateful. And make sure I see you, because if I don't, I'll carry on anyway. So, good afternoon once again. Some of you, I'm sure, were here this morning during the panel discussion, and you may possibly remember the first words I used when I spoke. I'd like to repeat those words. One of the consequences of globalization is that we live in a world in which there is only one remaining superpower, and that superpower is international public opinion. In one way or another, all of us, whether we work in cities or countries or regions or even for companies, are trying to do diplomacy with that superpower. In the hands of those 7 billion people lie the fate of nations. Around the world, in every moment of every day, a million decisions are being made by members of that superpower. Ordinary people like you and me are making casual decisions every moment of every day. Where we're going to go on holiday, where we're going to go and study, which products we're going to buy and which countries those products come from, which films we're going to watch and where the directors of those films come from, which music we're going to listen to and where that music comes from. We live in a wonderfully, gloriously cosmopolitan world in which all of the things that we use or consume or share or learn or read or talk about could come from almost literally anywhere. And therefore, in the hands of those 7 billion people making those trillions of decisions lie the fate of nations. So let me start my story back in about 1995 or 96, when I accidentally coined a very unfortunate phrase. Now, I'm usually accused of being the person who invented the expression nation branding. This is not true. I didn't invent that phrase. The phrase I may have invented, in fact I know I invented because I checked it, was not nation branding, but nation brand. Now you may be thinking 3 letters in an English word, what difference can that possibly make? And why is this man wasting our time with academic discourses about the difference that 3 letters make? Actually, they make a very significant difference, and I'd like to try to explain why. The paper I wrote, and I checked in 1996 or whenever it was called Nation Brands of the 21st Century. Now, like all arrogant fools, when I wrote this paper, I just had a thought, and I assumed I was the first person in the world to have the thought. And the thought I had was that in the age of globalization, countries, cities, regions, places all have to compete with other countries and cities and regions all over the world. The consequence of this modern phase of globalization is that we all woke up one morning, probably in the 1980s, and discovered that we were having to compete, not just with our neighbors, not just with companies and countries and cities within our own region, but companies and countries and cities all around the world, in places that we perhaps had never even heard of before, places we couldn't reliably point to on a map. And in a situation like that, when you're competing globally, suddenly, I claimed in my paper, reputation becomes incredibly important. It becomes all important. For the simple reason that nobody really knows enough about the world to be able to make fully informed decisions. The last time I checked, I think there were 205 countries on the planet. None of us, even if we're students of international relations or geographers, really have very much knowledge about all of those 205 countries. We're all very cosmopolitan, we're all highly educated, we all travel a good deal. But do we really know very much about 205 countries? Of course we don't. And the majority of people in the majority of countries who don't travel and are not students of international relations or geography know virtually nothing about those other countries. And in the absence of any knowledge, what is sucked into that vacuum is perception, belief, prejudice, ignorance, if you like. We don't know anything about Japan or Uruguay or Turkey or Kenya, so what we believe about those countries becomes much more important than the reality, because we don't know the reality. Forgive me if this all sounds a little philosophical, but I think it's quite important, because what it tells me, and what it told me when I wrote this paper, is that we now live in an age where perception is effectively more important than reality, because the reality is not known. So the claim I made in this article was simply this: governments in the 21st century have to become brand managers as much as policy makers. They need to understand that the image, the perception, the reputation, the profile of their place is as important as the reality, perhaps even more important. Because all places, as I said before, need to compete with all other places. They need visitors, they need investors, they need talent, they need major events, they need markets for their products, they need profile. And they will not get that visitation, that investment, that attention, that level of international engagement, unless they have a high profile, unless people know about them. Now, if you're lucky enough to come from a country like Sweden or Switzerland, for example, which has a very positive reputation worldwide, everybody everywhere thinks they know that Sweden and Switzerland are wonderful, successful, attractive countries. If you come from a country like that, everything is easy and everything is cheap. If you want to attract more tourists, you only have to say the magic word, Sweden or Switzerland, and people will come. If you want investors, those magic words work in exactly the same way. If you are from Sweden or from Switzerland, your life is relatively easy, because you also have an invisible label just in the middle, at the back of your neck, that says made in Sweden or made in Switzerland. And when it comes to trying to study abroad or to get a job abroad, that little label makes your life so much easier. I've researched this, and many other people have researched it as well, and it really is dramatic what a difference these prejudices make. In my main survey, the Nation Brands Index, one of the questions I ask people, ordinary people around the world, I ask them this. I say, imagine that you're running a company and you're trying to recruit a senior manager for an important position in your company. And imagine you have two candidates in front of you for that job. They are both completely identical in terms of their experience, their background, their age, their salary requirements. In every respect, identical candidates. The only difference is that candidate A comes from Turkey and candidate B comes from Sweden. Which one will you hire? 70% of my respondents around the world say, I'll hire the Swedish one, even though I've told them that they are precisely identical. The really funny thing is that 60% of the Turkish people I interview say they would rather hire the Swedish candidate. Now that's a little bit worrying if you're Turkish, because it suggests that if they don't have faith in their own product, it's rather unlikely anybody else is going to. Although that number is improving, by the way, Turkey is becoming almost every year more confident in itself. But that country of origin effect does have an impact on people. And I discovered it myself. I remember once speaking at a conference somewhere, and after I'd finished speaking, a girl came up to me and she said, "Oh, I thought you were going to be American." And I said, "No, I was always going to be British, but why do you say so?" And she said, "Well, because I'd already made up my mind that if you were American, I wouldn't pay any attention to what you said." And I said, "Why ever not?" And she said, "Well, think about it. The idea of an American going around advising other people on the images of their countries is a bit of a joke, isn't it?" Well, I don't think it's a bit of a joke at all, but it does prove something, doesn't it, about country of origin effect for people. Now, I said that I was an ignorant and arrogant fool when I wrote this paper, and that was the reason, because I thought I'd just discovered this fact. And shortly after I published this paper, I received a letter from a Canadian academic, a very cold, polite letter, in which he informed me that what I called nation brand wasn't something I'd just invented. It was very well known in the field of marketing academia, a field of whose existence I was not previously aware, and he was the world's leading authority on this subject and had himself either written or edited at least 50 academic papers on this subject since 1961 or something of that sort, the year in which I was born. So I felt suitably chastised, and I thought, time I started reading some of the academic literature about country of origin effect. Now, let me take 30 seconds to explain what country of origin effect means. Basically, it means what it says, the effect that the country of origin has on a product. So here in front of me is a bottle of sparkling natural mineral water, which bears the label San Pellegrino. Now, one of the interesting things about the Italian language is that you don't need to speak a word of Italian to be able to recognize the Italian language. All Italian words, it seems, end in something like ino, or etto, or ello, or azzo, or atto. Yeah? It rhymes. It's a lovely poetic language that rhymes. Immediately you say, ah, Italy. Water from Italy, it makes perfect sense. Because Italy is all about lifestyle, it's all about quality of food and drink, it's all about enjoying yourself, it's all about savoir vivre, as the French would say. It doesn't quite work in Italian, saper vivere. And so of course it works. And of course if you have a choice between an Italian mineral water, oh, I've got 2 Italian mineral waters here, the other one is called acqua panna. There you are, there's no choice. If I had a French one, I might choose that. But supposing my mineral water came instead from Uruguay, or Vietnam, or Rwanda, would it have the same impact on me? Would I feel the same way about it? After all, when you're drinking water, it's a rather special relationship that you have with that product. You're not simply buying it, you're also wrapping yourself around it. You're putting that substance inside your body. At the heart of every decision about buying food or drink is the primitive fear of poisoning. I have to trust absolutely San Pellegrino or acqua panna not to poison me when I drink their water. And if I'm drinking water that comes from one of those other countries, perhaps I'm afraid it won't be pure. Perhaps I'm afraid that it's going to be laced with polonium. So in one way or another, country of origin effect is tremendously, critically important, particularly with food and drink, but also with cars, for example. We all trust a German car, of course we do, because we trust the Germans. We trust a Japanese car, of course we do, because we trust the Japanese. Would you trust a car that was made in Paraguay? Why not? Some people might have a problem with that. I wouldn't. But then that's because I've been to Paraguay and I know what clever, reliable, efficient people they are. But one way or another, that's country of origin effect, and it's tremendously important. My argument in this paper back in 1996 was simply that country of origin effect applies to everything that the country does and everything that the city does. I've told you about the people. I've told you about the products. It also applies to the culture. Imagine I'm walking down the street here in Moscow, and I see a poster on a lamppost that says, opening next week, the Chinese State Circus. And then on the next corner, I see another poster that says, opening next week, the Zimbabwean State Circus. Already in my mind, don't laugh, Zimbabwe is a serious country. In my mind, I already have very different notions about those two cultural products. I know about the Chinese State Circus. I expect it will be very clever, very brilliant, very well organized, very spectacular. The Zimbabwean State Circus? I don't know. I don't know what to think about it. It's entirely surprising. Now, because I am who I am, perhaps a little odd, I'll go for the Zimbabwean State Circus because I want to be surprised. Most people don't want to be surprised. Listen, I've got to tell you something. I'm incredibly old. I'm much, much older than you think. I'm actually 52 years old, super old. And one of the things that I've discovered in those 52 years is that most people don't want to be surprised. It was a great and tragic discovery of mine. It's dawned on me slowly because I'm also rather stupid. It took me a long time to figure it out. I like to be surprised. Most people don't. The other sad thing I discovered is that I like different people. And I assumed everybody else was the same. And I discovered they're not. Most people like the same people. I don't know why, by some accident of fate or creed or religion or race or upbringing or DNA or parenthood or environment, I grew up in a way that I suppose you might call naturally cosmopolitan. I always assumed that people from other countries were going to be somehow more interesting than people from my own country. To me, this seems completely normal. And for the first 39 years of my life, I assumed that everybody else was like that at all. Gradually, from 39 onwards, it began to dawn on me that actually most people are not like that. Most people actually think that people from other countries and other cultures are less interesting and probably not worth knowing than people from their own country. Now, you may think at this point that I'm just burbling, that I'm not really making an awful lot of sense, but I do promise this all ties together at some point in the end. And because I've been given so much time, I have the luxury of being able to make these points in a slow and leisurely fashion. The other thing that it took me a very long time to discover is that the majority of politicians are even less cosmopolitan than the average population. And this causes me a particular professional problem. I have a very unusual job. My job is advising presidents and prime ministers on how they can help their country or their city to engage more fully and more effectively with the international community. The terrible discovery I made is that your average national politician cares even less about foreigners than most of the people that he or she is responsible for making policy for. If you think about it, I suppose that was to be expected. Because if you're the sort of person that wants to become a politician, then almost by definition, you are obsessed by domestic issues. You are obsessed by domestic policy, domestic structures, the nation, national feeling, your people, your population. Perhaps that's the way it should be, and perhaps there's nothing wrong with it. But it does mean that I frequently have bizarre, almost surreal conversations with the people who run countries, trying to persuade them that this little detail called the rest of the world is actually quite important, and maybe a bit more important than they think. A particular anecdote comes to mind. A few years ago, the president of a large republic who I was advising had an opportunity to speak at a very, very high-profile international conference. This was an opportunity for the whole world to hear what this man was going to say. So important was it that I insisted on writing his speech for him. I don't normally write speeches, but on this occasion I thought I'd better do it. So I asked his speechwriter to take a day off, and I wrote a speech. Brothers and sisters, you have to believe me, I'm not boasting. If he'd read that speech, it would have changed the world. It was beautiful. It's the best thing I've ever written. Really, it would have touched the hearts of everybody who read it. It was all about the gigantic shared issues of the global age in which we live and how he and his country were dedicated towards trying to resolve them. Well, he got up on the stage, and I was watching on TV, and the speech he gave was completely different from the one that I wrote for him. And afterwards, it wasn't bad, but it was completely different. And it was all about his country. And what he was doing what he'd spent the last 7 or 8 years doing, which was bragging about how wonderful his country was. And I said to him afterwards, I said, "What made you change your mind, Mr. President? How come you didn't read the speech I wrote for you?" And he said, "Well, you know, it was a lovely speech, and I really wanted to, but I suddenly realized, my God, if I read that speech, the insert here name of prominent national newspaper in his own country, that newspaper would have crucified me." And I thought to myself, my God, that is literally unbelievable, that he's got in front of him, via television and the internet, probably 2 billion people listening to every word he said. And he was more worried about one newspaper back home in his own country criticizing him for what he was going to say. And I said to him, "Listen, they're going to crucify you whatever you say. It makes no difference at all domestically. But the simple fact of the matter is that if you'd provided a little bit of international leadership and the rest of the world's media had noticed it and they had started saying, this man has an interesting message, it's possible that the domestic media back home might have started regarding you with a little more respect because you were a global leader." But never mind. Let me get back to my story. So the point I was making was that countries suffer from country of origin effect in almost everything they do, the people, the products, the culture. Even the very mechanical investment decisions which matter so much to the economies of countries and cities and regions today. Russia, like any other country, depends for its economic growth very substantially on foreign investment. Now, there's a habit in foreign direct investment circles to believe that the people who make major investment decisions are not quite human. They are sort of robots, they are automata, and they only have heads, they don't have hearts. And consequently, things like image and perception make no difference to their choices. Well, let me tell you a story. When I was working in Holland, in the Netherlands, a few years ago, I remember talking to the investment promotion agency. They were very, very upset because they'd been expecting a major foreign investment. A large multinational corporation had decided, finally, that they were going to build their European headquarters in Amsterdam. And the boss of this corporation was due to arrive at Schiphol Airport on Thursday morning to sign a memorandum of understanding with the Dutch government about this major investment. And the entire investment promotion agency and the mayor of Amsterdam and a lot of other senior officials were all standing there waiting for the plane to land from Chicago or Minneapolis or wherever it was, and the chief executive didn't come. Everybody got off the plane, desperate inquiries were made, the individual could not be located. It finally turned out that he hadn't got on the plane in the first place. So the mayor, the dignitaries, the officials all went home feeling rather silly. It was only afterwards they discovered, by reading it in the newspaper, that this multinational corporation had decided to open their headquarters in Paris instead. The same day, without any preliminary discussions, without any data, and the answer, the reason they later discovered, was that the chairman's wife expressed a preference for shopping in Paris over shopping in Amsterdam. Now, that is, of course, a very sad story for all kinds of reasons. I hardly know where to start. The obvious one being that it sounds like a sexist joke, and it's not a sexist joke, it's pure reality. But perhaps the significant one from the point of view of the issue that I'm trying to describe now is that that massive decision on which rested the livelihoods of many thousands of people and many millions of euros over many years, rested in the end on a very human decision. Human beings have several organs within their bodies, but two of the most significant ones are the one in here and the one here, the head and the heart. The Buddhists, of course, who understand these things better than most, don't think that your emotions reside in your heart, but actually in your belly, and they are correct. Your feelings don't come from here, they come from here. In English, we say you have a gut feeling about something. Yeah. Most people make an entirely false distinction between gut feeling and intellectual ratiocination. They think you work things out in your head, but you have a gut feeling in your stomach. And it's best to ignore the gut feeling because it's sometimes wrong, it's not literal, it's not rational, it's not intellectual. Actually, they're entirely wrong. I believe that human beings have got two very logical computers inside them. They have a very small, very weak computer called the brain. That has the same processing capacity as a pocket calculator manufactured by Texas Instruments in 1973. It's not very good. My brain, which is expensively trained, is a pretty poor creature. I can just about use my brain to figure out when I go into a shop whether to buy Pepsi or Coke, just about, although I have a lot of trouble, and I often catch myself standing there, paralyzed by this choice for many minutes, and people think I'm strange, but I'm just normal. I don't have a very powerful computer in my head, but I have a supercomputer in my belly. And it is so powerful that I am not even clever enough to recognize its operation as rational. It is not irrational at all. It is super rational. It is mega rational. Because what it's doing is it's processing instantaneously trillions of terabytes of accumulated data. Every experience I've ever had in the whole of my life, every experience of every other person whose experience I've heard about at second or third or fourth or fifth hand, everything I've ever imagined, everything I've ever believed, all of that data, which is unimaginably huge, it can process in the flash of a second and transmit it to my brain and tell me infallibly what is the right choice to make. Because my pilot computer is so weak, it doesn't even recognize that flow of data as data. It just feels like a surge. So here's a little personal advice, if I may be so bold as to give you personal advice. I'm older than most of you, so I think I'm allowed to. Try to attune yourself to that sensation. Learn to listen to it. When you feel a surge of something coming up from your belly towards the upper regions, listen to it and respect it. That's your supercomputer. And it's a much, much more reliable guide to behavior than the creaky little pocket calculator in your head. Don't try to think through decisions. You'll get it wrong. Feel them through, and you're more likely to get it right. Don't sue me, by the way, if you make a wrong decision as a result of that. But I've found that that usually works. So why do I tell you all this? Well, I tell you this because basically it's the key to human nature. We are animals like this. We are not rational. We are fundamentally emotional, all of us. Anthropology tells us that some races appear to be more than the others. Anthropology tells us that you Russians are volcanic, emotional, unpredictable, full of a boiling, peppery stew of crazy emotions. I love that. But you know, we're all like that to some extent. Even the British, who are regarded as being rather serious-minded and cold, don't listen to a word they tell you. The British are guided by their emotions and by little else. We're purely emotional, just like everybody else. We've just learned how to disguise it rather badly. And by the way, we're not rude and cold, we're shy. It's very different. Anyway, my point is simply that unless you can understand the way that the world works through the emotions of people, you're probably always going to miss the mark. Which was, eventually I get there, the reason why I coined this phrase, nation brand. Because it seemed to me that there was a very interesting parallel here between the way that products work in the marketplace and the way that countries, cities, and regions work in the marketplace of globalization. In other words, we have so little knowledge, we have so little intellectual capacity, we proceed on the basis of feeling. And where do those feelings come from? I remember when I first started trying to find out about brands, I was very interested in them, and I went to speak to a number of corporations. One of the corporations I spoke to was Nike. It's a company in America that makes running shoes. amongst other things. In case you hadn't heard, I guess probably you have, but I went to speak to them, and I said to the boss of Nike, I said, what's the Nike brand? What is this? What's it for? What does it do for you? And he said, oh, our brand, he said, it makes buying office furniture a lot easier for us. I was quite surprised by that reaction. I was expecting him to reply in the kind of evangelical way that American chief executives usually do when you mention the word brand. In fact, I'd met quite a lot of chief executives who spoke about brand in that very evangelical way. When I said to them, what is your brand for you? They would pause, and a dreamy look would come into their eyes, and they would say, our brand is our mission. It is our vision. It is the way in which we know who we are and where we are going. It is the way in which we will march together. And they would carry on like that. And if I hadn't stopped them, I suspect they'd have jumped onto the table and harangued me for an hour and a half. So I was expecting the same thing at Nike, but the guy said no. He said, it's about buying office furniture. So I said to him, can you explain, please? And he said, yep. He said, before we had our brand, we had a problem. We didn't know how to buy office furniture. He said, I would go into meetings around the Nike headquarters, and I'd find senior management staff wasting hours of precious time debating trivial issues, like what sort of desks do we buy? And they would waste hours over this stuff, and one person would be saying, the black one's funkier, and somebody else would be saying, the metal one is more now. And somebody else would say, yeah, but the IKEA one is cheaper and we don't want to waste money. And so it would go on. And in the end, as always happens in meetings, the individual in the room with the most testosterone would win, and thus the decision would be made. And he said, and then we hired an advertising agency to do an ad campaign for us, and they came up with this slogan, just do it. Okay, I didn't know what the hell that meant, and neither did anybody else, and I suspect neither did they, but they told us not to question it, and they told us it wasn't a slogan anyway, it was a mantra or something like that, and it was our vision, our mission, and all the rest of it, and we said, okay, fine, and we adopted it, and then I noticed we were having no more silly meetings about office furniture. So I called the chief operating officer, and I said, how come we're not wasting time on silly decisions anymore? And he said, oh, boss, it's become so easy suddenly. Anybody in the organization can now choose the desk. You open an office furniture catalog, and anybody in the company, from the chief executive down to the man who cleans the toilets, can just say, that's the Just Do It desk. That's the Just Do It desk. That has some sort of meaning, remarkable though it may seem, because just do it implies a kind of a philosophy, a kind of attitude, a kind of personality. And it suddenly occurred to me, gosh, brand, it's a way of making lots of people behave as if they were one person. That's all it is. And if we look back through the history of humanity, we find the truth of that famous statement, which I think was made by Napoleon Bonaparte, who said, small armies can defeat very large armies if only their soldiers march exactly in step. And this is true for any organization, any group of people, from a basketball team to a mighty nation like Russia. If there is something that enables everybody to share the same goal, the same purpose, the same notion of where they're going, they will become infinitely more efficient and effective in the way that they make decisions. And thus, all other things being equal, they will prevail. And that's what brand is all about. It's about synthesizing commonality of purpose, common purpose. Whether you're a basketball team or a great nation like Russia, if you all have a shared idea about why you're here and where you're going, you're much more likely to get there. What I didn't say was branding. What is branding? I don't know what the hell branding is. If there's a branding expert in the audience, perhaps they know. The trouble is that the word brand itself is used to mean so many different things. And the word branding, as far as I can tell, has no meaning at all. Brand means that. It means the logo. It means the clothes that you dress your product in. Now, that's very easy to manipulate. If you're a corporation, you can redesign that every week of the year if you want to. You have complete control over it. But the word brand, in that sense, means brand identity. It's a design activity. But the word brand is also used to mean brand image, which is something completely different. Brand image is the idea I have in my head about San Pellegrino. In other words, it is the context in which San Pellegrino comes. The brand image is the context in which messages are received. It's not the message itself. Let me try to illustrate this with a stupid story. Let's take two airlines, one with a very good brand and one with a very bad brand. We'll start with the one with the very bad brand. Now, I have to be careful here. Let us pick an imaginary airline from an imaginary country. Let us say that in some far-off and not very well-known East African country is a national airline called Plummet Airlines. And let's just imagine that Plummet Airlines decide that it's time to improve the image of their corporation because they're not doing well. Now, the boss of Plummet Airlines has heard, perhaps from somebody like me, that it's about what you do and not what you say. So he sends his executives out around the world on a fact-finding mission and says, go find out what all those other airlines are doing that's so clever, and we'll do it too. So his executives go out and they come back a week or so later, and the first one says, boss, I've got it. And the boss says, what is it? And the first executive says, all those other airlines that have got such great brands, they don't crash. And he gets fired. The second executive comes back a couple of days later and says, boss, I've got it. And the chief executive says, this had better be good. And she says, no, this is good. The other airlines these days, she said, they have flat beds in business class, so people can lie down and sleep on longer flights. And we don't have business class. So the chief executive says, that's it. That's our mission. That's the way that we are going to improve the brand of Plummet Airlines. But because we're Plummet, we're going to go one better. We're not just going to have flat beds in business class. We're going to have flat double beds in business class. Bridal suites, so you can sleep with a friend. And because his word is law, the fleet is rebuilt. And business class, at vast expense, is created. And at doubly vast expense, double flat reclining beds are installed. And the chief executive of Plummet holds a press conference and invites the world's media. Let's imagine that this is the press conference now, and I'm the chief executive, and I say, ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement to make. From next month, you can fly Plummet Airlines new business class, and you can sleep with a friend. What's the reaction? Well, I don't know. What's your reaction? My reaction? Horror. Okay, if I'm flying Plummet Airlines, I do not want to sleep with a friend. I do not want to sleep. I don't want a reclining seat. I want to sit there with my boots laced up, my seatbelt securely fastened, my tray table in the upright position until we land, when I will hurl myself down the steps and kiss the ground because we've arrived in one piece. That's my view about double beds on Plummet Airlines. Right? Now let's take the airline with the good brand. Let's take Virgin Atlantic, a great British brand. And let's just imagine for a moment that Richard Branson, the bearded, woolly jumper-wearing chief executive of Virgin Atlantic, makes the same decision. And let's imagine the press conference where he announces it. And he stands up in front of the world's media and he says, ladies and gentlemen, from next month, you can fly Virgin's new upper class and you can sleep with a friend. Now, we don't have to imagine the reaction because he did this. And we know what the reaction was. The reaction was delight. Everybody said the same thing. They said, how fantastic, how funky, how British, how Virgin. Where do I buy my ticket? And they did it. You see, it's exactly the same message, received in precisely the opposite way. And that's why I say that your brand image is the context in which your messages are received, not the message itself. So when I spoke about nation brand, I wasn't talking about nation branding. I was talking about the perception that people have of your country, which determines the fate of your nation and the fate of your city. And that's why I said the fateful words. In the 21st century, governments have got to become, in a sense, brand managers as much as policymakers. You've all seen those figures that measure the goodwill of corporate brands. I think Interbrand and Business Week do one every year, which measures the most powerful commercial brands every year, and they value them. And the numbers they produce are extraordinary. Billions and billions of dollars, many times the tangible assets of most of those companies, particularly today, since the most valuable companies don't have tangible assets, they only have goodwill and intangible assets. Most of those companies are actually worth 5, 7, 10 times more than their tangible assets would dictate, would suggest. And that's because they have goodwill, the permission to trade. People like them, they esteem them, they admire them, they want to buy from there. They believe in what that company does. Countries find themselves in exactly the same situation. So that was my argument, and that was the paper I wrote, and that was the point I was trying to make. Branding suggests, it seems to contain a promise that if you don't like the image of your country, then you can somehow fix it. You can somehow change it. Now, every single country I've ever been to, and that's quite a lot of countries, are not happy with their image. They all think that they are misunderstood. They all think they deserve to be better known than they really are. There are a few that think that they've got a better reputation than they deserve, but that's fairly unusual. It's usually the other way round. I have a regular experience which I want to share with you. I get phone calls from governments all the time. I mean, once a month. And these governments, they ring me up and they say, apparently we've got a crap image, can you fix it? And I always answer in the same way. I say, are you perhaps a crap country? And they get really offended. But you've got to ask, haven't you? I mean, the most likely reason why you've got a crap image is because you're crap. I mean, that is the... Am I allowed to use bad words like that? I suppose I am. We're in Russia. I think it's probably okay. And so I say to them, don't assume that just because everybody else thinks you're rubbish, it's because they're ignorant. It may well be because from their point of view, you are rubbish. Effectively, the question that these countries invariably ask is this. They say, what can we say to make ourselves more famous? Because they all know, whether they're cities or countries or regions, that if only they had a better image, if only they were more like Sweden or Switzerland, everything would be so much easier. So what can they do? What's the shortcut? How can they make people understand that they're so much better than people already think? But it's a stupid question. There's nothing you can say to make yourself more famous because you're not selling anything. Everybody out there, by definition, has a perfectly good country of their own. They come from a country. They're not in the market for a new country. They don't want to buy Russia or buy Moscow. You're not selling anything. And so this idea that you can say something to make yourself famous has to be replaced with a slightly more tricky question, which is what can we do to make ourselves relevant? What can we do to make ourselves relevant? And in a funny, ironic kind of way, this is actually just basic marketing. Let me tell you what bad marketing is. I'm not a marketing expert, but I understand enough to know what bad marketing is. Bad marketing is when you just publish lists of all the good reasons why people should admire your product. Yeah? You just tell them what's good about it. This water, it's very watery. Yeah? And it's entirely transparent. It's a liquid, and it serves very effectively to stop you feeling thirsty after you've taken it. And it's in a bottle, and it's quite expensive, and so on and so on. Very bad marketing. I don't think I sold a single bottle there. Good marketing starts not with the product or with the seller, but with the buyer. And I start by going up to you, and if they'd given me a roving microphone, I probably would have wandered around and asked each of you in turn, what are your feelings about thirst? Are you feeling thirsty? At the most basic level, that's how good marketing works. Instead of saying, great product, it says, feeling thirsty? And that simple basic premise is at the heart not just of marketing, but of all human engagement. You start with the other person. You start with what they want. I remember I was once in a hotel room somewhere watching television, and in one of the advertising breaks, to my surprise, there appeared the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni. And he told me, and the other 9 or 10 people who were watching CNN at that point in time, that Uganda was, and let me see if I can remember the phrase, gifted by nature. The reason I was surprised was because Mr. Museveni was not talking to me in a program, but in an advertisement. He or his government had spent a lot of money buying an advertising slot on CNN to tell me and everybody else who was listening that Uganda was gifted by nature. And so I thought about this for a while, and I thought, okay, do I believe this? For a start, what do I think about Uganda before I hear this message? I'm an ignorant fool from Britain. And what do I know about Uganda? I know that Uganda is in Africa, I think. Yeah, it's in Africa. And because it's in Africa, it is poor, dirty, corrupt, disease-ridden, war-torn, and generally speaking, a burden on the planet. I've believed that all my life. I started believing it when I was about 5, when my mother, who was a noted political scientist, explained to me that by some extraordinary mechanism, which she never fully explained to me, that if I didn't eat all the food on my plate, then children in Uganda would starve, but they were already starving anyway. Her economics were extraordinarily sophisticated, and I never quite followed the argument. But that was the point at which I began to learn about Uganda. And then Yoweri Museveni appears on the television and tells me that actually I'm wrong, and that Uganda is gifted by nature. What am I going to do? Am I going to stop and say, my God, I've been wrong all my life? Uganda is not poor, disease-ridden, war-torn, corrupt burden on the planet. It's actually the Garden of Eden. Of course I'm not. Of course I'm not. It takes more than that to make me change the beliefs and the habits of a lifetime. If anything, what I'm going to think is, yep, I was right. Uganda is a poor, dirty, disease-ridden, war-torn, corrupt burden on the planet. And what's more, they must be even more corrupt than I suspected. Otherwise, where did they steal all the money to do this expensive advertising? That's what I'm going to think. You see, my friends, propaganda no longer works. It is the great, perhaps the greatest success of globalization, that it has rendered propaganda, quite literally, impossible. Propaganda only works if you control all the channels of information reaching your end user. Kim Jong-il could still do it to some degree, even though it was becoming permeable thanks to the internet. If you tell people the same message, something that those of you who are old enough to remember the Soviet system will know very well, if you give people the same message over and over and over again and they never hear another message, in the end they'll give up and they'll believe it by default, because there's nothing else to believe. The fantastic thing about globalization is that it has now made that impossible, because nobody controls all the channels of information. Russia, or Uganda, or Uruguay, or Rwanda could spend 5 times, 10 times their gross domestic product pumping out messages about how they are gifted by nature or the world's greatest country, and it would be simply ignored. Because for every message that says the official line, there will be 100,000 messages saying the opposite, and consequently it goes nowhere. The reason I detest the word branding is because it seems to contain that promise that there is some kind of marketing message that can go inside the heads of people around the world with a little screwdriver and fix the things that they think. There is no possible technique or tool or method for doing that. You cannot get inside people's heads. People believe things because they have no other reason to believe the opposite. So let me see if I can begin to draw this all to some kind of conclusion. I think that it's pretty clear, it's always been fairly clear to me, that places today depend on their reputations as never before. If you've got a good, powerful, positive reputation, everything is easy and everything is cheap. If you've got a bad, weak, or negative reputation, everything is difficult and everything is expensive. You spend more money on investment promotion. You spend more money on tourism promotion. You spend more money on cultural relations. You spend more money on arguing and persuading people that despite what they believe, the country, the city is really better than they think. It's very expensive. The citizens of countries and cities with bad images end up paying more taxes to make up for the fact that they labor under a negative or a weak reputation. If I don't know who you are, or I think you're bad, I will always assume the worst. Let me give you another silly anecdote just to prove, at least theoretically, the validity of that point. I have a friend called Philip. I've known Philip all my life. I trust him. I know he's a good guy. If I read in the newspaper one day that Philip, he's called Philip Hammond, that Philip Hammond was arrested for shoplifting, he stole something from Harrods in London, my immediate reaction is, oh my God, what a terrible mistake. They got the wrong guy. Because I know him. I know he wouldn't do that. And my immediate assumption, no matter how much information I receive, will prevent me from believing that the man I know is a thief. If, on the other hand, I read in the newspaper that Philip Drummond has been arrested for shoplifting, my immediate reaction is to believe it and to say, shocking, isn't it? That people have to steal things from shops. What a terrible thing. What a terrible indictment of the society that we live in today. Do you see? Two names, two totally different beliefs. If people know you as a country or as a city, and they trust you and they believe you, whatever bad news they hear about you, their first reaction will be not to believe it. If you have an image vacuum, if people don't know you, they don't trust you, or they know or they think they believe bad things about you, whatever they hear that's bad, they will believe. You have an image vacuum into which everything bad becomes sucked. It is a tremendously vulnerable position to be in. And what I see today, when I look at my survey, and I look at Moscow, and I look at Russia, and I look at the other cities and regions of Russia, I see a tremendous vulnerability. I see an image vacuum. Whatever one hears that's bad, that's negative, it sticks. It gets sucked into that vacuum because people have nothing good to believe about the country or the city, so they believe the bad things. Let's just imagine that for a moment the government of Switzerland arrested a pop group for singing a dangerous song. What would be our reaction to that around the world? We'd say, well, they'll vote them out at the next election for sure. Or maybe that decision will be instantly reversed. Or maybe we'll just find it so unbelievable that we'll simply discard it. We'll discount it. It's not even the things that happen, it's the way that you believe it. I had a phone call from a Finnish journalist a few months ago, and he said to me, Mr. Anholt, I want to interview you about the global sauna competition which took place in Helsinki a few weeks ago. And I said, how very interesting. What would you like to ask me about it? And he said, well, you heard the news, of course, about the unfortunate contestant who died because it was too hot and he stayed in the sauna too long. I suspect it may have been a Russian, actually. And he said, now, obviously, this has destroyed the image of Finland. My question to you, Mr. Anholt, is how long before Finland can recover its good reputation? How long will it take? And I thought about that, and I thought, peculiar question. So I said to him, I said, okay, let me ask you a question. You're not supposed to do this with journalists, but I did. I said, You read, of course, about that episode that took place in Accra in Ghana a couple of weeks ago, where a masked gunman broke into the Central Criminal Court and pointed a gun at the judge, and the proceedings were held up for the entire morning. And it was a scandal because afterwards it was discovered that it was a toy gun. Now, obviously, that's destroyed the image of Ghana for you. Answer that question: how long will it be before you as a Finn start to look at Ghana again in a more positive way? And there was an embarrassed silence, and after a while the Finnish journalist said to me, well, actually, I have to admit, I don't remember reading about that. And I said, exactly. And I don't remember reading about the sauna competition either. Just because you're in a country and it means a lot to you does not mean that the rest of the world is thinking about it every day. I think the world's population think about Finland, if you're lucky, for 1 or 2 seconds every year. And if you really wanted to damage the image of something, you would have to engineer the death of a contestant every week for a year. And then maybe at the end of it, you might succeed in temporarily damaging the image of sauna, but not of Finland. Finland's image is gigantic and robust. It has taken a century and a bit to create, and that's the way it is with national images. They don't move. One of the things that my survey, the Nation Brands Index, has taught me is that people never change their minds about other countries, or almost never. They are fixed. They are the way in which we navigate through the complexity of the global environment. We cannot go around changing our minds about cities or countries or regions. If we did, we'd simply have no time left to do anything else. I said there were 205 countries in the world. How many cities are there? Thousands upon thousands. If we changed our mind about Moscow every time we read something about it in the newspaper, or every time they hosted an Olympic Games, or every time there was a terrorist attack in the subway, we would spend the whole of our waking lives busily changing our minds about places. We don't do that. We hang on to our prejudices very, very tightly indeed, because they represent security. We don't care whether it's right or wrong. They represent stability and security and certainty. My survey shows, for example, that Ireland is regarded still as being a very poor and backward country. And that's rather ironic, because that particular perception dates from around about 1979, and it stopped being true from around about 1989, and has now started being true all over again. And the original belief about Ireland still hasn't moved. When I interview people in Europe about perceptions of Scotland, I get young people in their 20s quoting entire passages from the novelist Sir Walter Scott without even realizing they're doing it. They've never heard of Sir Walter Scott, but somehow his vision of Scotland, all that nonsense about men wearing skirts and eating the insides of sheep, has stuck, and it doesn't move. The images of countries and cities are like starlight. I once had an affair with an astrophysicist. She was hot, but she wasn't romantic, and I just remember one particular evening, I suspect it may have been our last evening, and we went out onto a hill in London, and it was a beautiful clear night, and the stars were twinkling in the heavens, and I said to her, "How beautiful the stars are tonight," and she looked at me rather severely and said, "The stars were, Simon, the stars were." I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, because of course the stars you see now died out hundreds of millions of years ago, and the light has only reached us today." It spoiled the evening, but it made an important point. I think, one, that she wasn't the right woman for me, but two, I thought to myself, yes, so many things in this world are like that. The reputation lags tremendously behind the reality. And people's view of countries, if you're lucky, is 20 years out of date. If you're unlucky, maybe literally hundreds of years out of date. So let me talk a little bit about Russia and a little bit about Moscow, because you're probably beginning to get a bit impatient by this stage. I showed some data from one of my surveys at the panel this morning, which shows unequivocally that Moscow has a very prominent and very negative reputation. It is certainly one of the most famous cities in the world, but also one of the least admired. Please don't hate me for telling you this. Please don't shoot me or criticize me afterwards. This is not my opinion. This is the opinion of 38,000 of my closest friends. I take no responsibility whatever for their views. They are, like most of us, pretty ignorant. They live in other countries. They don't know very much. They don't think very much. They don't care very much about other cities. They think that Moscow is important, but they don't like the idea of it very much. They don't like the idea of the people or the climate in particular. As far as the climate, the weather goes, it ranks number 50 out of 50 for most people. It is the city with the perception of having the worst weather in the world, even by Russians. Not by Indians. You have an extraordinary opportunity in India. One of the things that my survey has showed me over and over again is that the Indians have an extraordinarily above average view of Russia and everything about it. Go figure. If somebody can explain that to me, I'd be very happy to hear the reason why. But the majority of people regard Moscow's climate as being just about the worst, certainly of those 50 cities. That's okay, we can live with that. I think it's perfectly possible, as places like Stockholm, Copenhagen, Reykjavik, other cold cities have shown, it's possible to make coldness attractive. Those winter destinations are attractive destinations. You simply have to find a way of creating a tourism product which makes people understand the coziness of the Russian home, the Russian interior in the winter. That's just a piece of cultural communication, a piece of cultural education which needs to be created. But the one that worries me more is the perception of the people in Moscow. The people are the city is the people. When we ask people in my survey about cities or countries, what they're really talking about is the people that they think live there. And here again, Moscow scores very poorly indeed, near the bottom. When we ask questions like, would you expect a warm welcome if you visited Moscow? The resounding answer is no, absolutely not. Only the countries which are believed to be extremely dangerous score lower than Moscow. Moscow is not regarded as being extremely dangerous, but it is regarded as being extremely unwelcoming. And yet, it is regarded as important. So the message, I believe, is one of strong potential. It is so much harder to do something about a city that has no reputation, because people don't have space in their minds to learn about any new places. It is so very hard to carve out a new space in anybody's minds. I said right at the beginning that there's only one superpower left on the planet, and that's global public opinion. Well, I want to tell you something else about global public opinion. It is a 6-year-old child. It has the intelligence, the learning, and the attention span of a 6-year-old. Remember that. It's not meant to be demeaning, it's simply a fact. So anything that you want to communicate to the rest of humanity, unless it's something that passes the 6-year-old test, in other words, it's something that you could say to a 6-year-old that you know, and that 6-year-old would understand it, like it, and want to tell his or her 6-year-old friends about it. Unless you can do that, you might as well forget it, because it's not going to go anywhere. I smile when marketing consultants talk to me about viral marketing as if it was something that they'd just invented. Of course, all marketing is viral and always has been. It's the only way that marketing ever works. Nobody on earth, not even Nike, can afford to send out a message to their entire target audience. What you do is you send out a message to a few people who will find that message sufficiently interesting and that it reflects sufficiently well on themselves that they will want to tell others about it. It's all viral. There is only viral. The only thing that's happened today is that the media has caught up with the virality of the human species. So, a few words to finish with. It's not what you say, it's what you do. Let us not fall into the trap of believing that propaganda can work for a city. It's really down to one very simple thing. What has Moscow done for me today? Let's Let's take a random person. Let's take an 11-year-old girl in Argentina. In the 30 seconds before she drifts off to sleep at night, what is her last thought? If her last thought is, God, I'm glad that Moscow exists, then we've succeeded. One person. If 7 billion people think, God, I'm glad that Moscow exists before they drift off to sleep, then we've succeeded totally. Somewhere between one person feeling glad that Moscow exists and 7 billion people is the spectrum of success for Moscow. Moscow will be unable to achieve any other form of success unless it can achieve that sense of importance, relevance to the lives of other people. Now, that may sound incredibly theoretical and incredibly difficult and incredibly long-term. Actually, it's childishly easy. Why? Because of the world that we live in. I started off with globalization. Globalization is the problem. Globalization is also the solution. Globalization so far has been extraordinarily effective at globalizing problems, globalizing crime, globalizing pandemics, globalizing market fragility and instability, globalizing terrorism, globalizing every damn bad thing that the wit of humanity has ever created. Still, globalization hasn't fulfilled its ultimate promise, which I believe it will, which is to globalize the solutions. We haven't yet succeeded in figuring out how to run ourselves like a species, like a planet. Watch Doha this week and you'll see exactly what I mean. But that's the reason why we're lucky. We're lucky to live in this age. Is it a Chinese blessing or a Chinese curse that says, may you live in interesting times? It's a blessing, not a curse. By God, do we live in interesting times? As I go to sleep, these are the things I worry about. I worry about climate change, about human rights, about democracy, about terrorism, about landmines, about nuclear proliferation, about pandemics, about climatic instability, species loss, women's rights, children's rights, education. We live in an age of continuous, ongoing global crisis, and there is virtually no sign of leadership at this level. Virtually none. Most of the politicians are patently unable to resolve their domestic problems. They struggle at home, let alone being able to resolve problems abroad. The fact that out there, millions upon millions of people will believe in Bono, for fuck's sake, to cure poverty, is a mark of how desperate we all are for leadership. I mean, if you get to the stage where you trust an elderly Irish rock star to cure generations of poverty and mismanagement, you are desperate indeed for leadership. All it takes is for a city like Moscow or a country like Russia to step up to the mark and solve its problems in an imaginative, collaborative, and freeware way and say, we understand what you all worry about. We suffer from the same problems here. We suffer from all these deficits, but we are tackling them in an imaginative way, and we're sharing those solutions with anybody who wants to share them. One of the things that it took me a very long time to understand about human nature is that 99.9% of all people would much rather be led than lead. And if only somebody, a city, a country, a region is prepared to stand up and show some leadership, they will find a following. So that's my advice for Russia. Worry about your image, but don't obsess about it. Understand that your reputation is fundamental and critical to everything you want to do, to your economic growth, to your power, to your influence in the world, to your survival. But don't believe that it's a matter of messaging. Understand that it's a matter of understanding what is your contribution. What is Moscow for? And why should that 11-year-old girl in Argentina go to sleep at night and think to herself, my God, I'm glad that Moscow exists? Thanks for your attention. Have we got time for questions? We've got 5 minutes. Does anybody want to ask a question or make an observation? My heart always sinks when somebody stands up after I've spoken and said, this isn't so much as a question as an observation. Can we have the microphone on? Try this one.
So, if there is no way to change global perception about country or about city, except if you don't improve yourself over the time, what kind of your advice is to Russia now for short-term period?
I don't think that there are, thank you very much for that question. I don't think that there are any short-term answers to perception problems. I have a very simple formula for any country that wants to improve its image, and that is strategy, substance, and symbolic actions. Strategy is what used to be called grand strategy. The leadership, and that means a coalition between government, business, and society, have to decide what Russia is for. What is Russia for? What is Moscow for? In the age of globalization, all places need to have an answer to that question. If the hand of God should accidentally slip tomorrow morning on the celestial keyboard and delete Russia or delete Moscow, God forbid, who would notice and why? Strategy. What's our gift to the world? Secondly, substance. Whatever that is, you do it, and you do it abundantly. Lots and lots and lots of good quality substance. And finally, symbolic actions. Do something amazing every day. Something amazing every day. And if you do that for 25 years, at the end of it, you will be the most welcome, the most admired country on earth. It's not about what you say, it's about what you do. Okay, shall we leave it there? Thanks for the question. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.